had a really neat conversation with a sweet friend this week. And it was about speaking and teaching and stuff like that. And this dear friend was trying to give me some pointers on how to communicate better, which I really like, because very rarely do I ever know if what I'm saying was received. And so in this conversation, the question was asked, what is your objective every time you talk? And I said, it's real simple. I said, my objective is that you don't learn any more scripture than you know. You don't learn a deeper biblical truth out of the text than you already know. I said, my sole purpose and my heart's desire every time I get up to speak is that somewhere in a sentence or in a word, or even in my awkward pauses or my rambling on, that the Lord would come and tap you in that, and that you would no longer mentally be focused on what I'm saying, and your eyes would turn to Him, and you and Him would have a conversation, or you would have an encounter with Him that went beyond the place that you were sitting. So I learned something really interesting. You're supposed to tell people what you're going to tell them, then you're supposed to tell them what you told them, then you're supposed to tell them what you're going to tell them, or something like that. I talk in circles. I don't talk in straight lines. And I don't care if you get my message. I just want you to run into Jesus. So I'm going to talk again about Gideon. But I don't care if you get anything about Gideon. I'm going to tell you about, see, I'm trying what she told me. I'm going to tell you about what I'm going to tell you. Yeah. But don't hear me. Because my sole objective is that I'm not heard. I just want you to meet Him. And whatever happens in you meeting Him surpasses far beyond anything that I'm going to spend 30 hours in a week trying to figure out how to tell you. So, Father, with all that being said, I did my best to tell them what I'm going to tell them. If they need to hear what I have to say, Lord, I let them hear it. But as I begin to speak this morning, Lord, I ask that you'd go up and down every aisle and every chair and begin to tap each one of us on the shoulder. And that you would catch us up, and that you would take us to a place beyond this room. That we had experienced the glory and the majesty and the wonder of all that you are, that only can be caught in a moment, but marks us for a lifetime. So Lord, I ask that you would release everything in heaven that allows those kind of things to happen. I ask that you would hold nothing back from us this morning. We just want you. We really don't want a message. We just want you. Even the best messages ever preached, that's not what changed a man. It was you that did the changing. So Lord, if we have any concepts of what Sunday mornings and guys standing in front of people speaking are supposed to be, or what it's supposed to look like, and what it's supposed to sound like, and what it's supposed to do, if any of our concepts don't don't match up with your idea, Lord, I ask that you'd begin to erase those away. And that you would have your way. That you would rewrite the definition of church and sermons and speakers and preachers and pastors and teachers and prophets and apostles and evangelists. That today that the eraser from heaven would come and erase man's idea that got overlaid on yours. So thank you for the privilege to talk in circles and not straight lines. In Jesus' name. So I was telling Joanna the other night, we was kind of talking on this line, and I told her, I said, Joanna, I said, best analogy I can give to you when I'm talking or speaking or even telling a story is it's like we're walking through the woods, and we're walking down this trail, and we're walking through the woods, and I begin to tell you about this cliff and how wonderful this cliff is and how big, and just kind of puts you in the place of awe, and how the rocks even look, and the jaggedness of the rocks. And as we're walking through the woods, I'm describing this cliff to you. I said, and as I'm doing this, you have no idea, but what I'm actually doing, I'm walking you to the edge of this cliff. I said, but you'll never see the jagged rocks until I push you over the cliff. I said, no, that's my objective. I'm going to walk you to the edge of the cliff, and I'm going to push you over the cliff, because once you go over the cliff, you'll see all the things that I described about this cliff, but you'll never see it standing on top of the cliff. I said, and if I told you I was going to push you over the cliff, you wouldn't go down the trail in the woods with me, because I'm going to leave a key important thing out as I'm telling this story. I understand and I know at the bottom of this cliff there's this big, beautiful, blue, deep pool of water that you're going to fall into. But the only way that you're ever going to see the rocks in the cliff is I have to push you over the edge. So that's kind of my objective of talking every time I get to talk. Is I don't know if I ever really accomplish it, but that's it. I want to take you on a trail, and the cliff is always Jesus. And some point in time, I want to push you over that cliff, and you just fall. You know, you fall, until you hit this big, beautiful pool of water, and you can look up and you can see the jagged rocks that I was telling you about on the cliff. You know, it's funny that it's called falling in love, because you have to fall to reach love. And that's really what we're trying to do, is just stay in love and fall more in love. So, if you get to the cliff, just go ahead and fall. So, back to Gideon. I'm going to talk about that just a little bit to kind of probably talk in circles. But no, just kind of sum some things up a little bit. But I'm going to leave the Bible pretty quick, and I'm going to tell a story that's going to relate more than a story out of a Bible. Not that that's not relevant, but you'll see. How about that? So the question was, what if what we think identity is actually the nature and the characteristics of the new birth, and not identity at all? The angel of the Lord shows up to Gideon, you mighty man of valor. And Gideon's story begins to unfold. Gideon, for the first time in his life, hears how heaven knows him. And he begins this journey with the Lord that led to a sacrifice that allowed him to walk into the reality of what heaven was saying over him. And the sacrifice took place, and Gideon stepped into the full reality of what heaven was declaring over him, how he was known, how his identity was seen in heaven. And as the sacrifice took place and Gideon had stood in the place of accepting who he was before the Lord, the tribe that he was in began to acknowledge what he was, and his name was changed forever. So, with that being said, let's jump to 1900. I didn't think I would ever to talk about history stuff, but here we are. So, in 1900, there's this guy that's and I forget how old he was, but he was a young man, and he'd been praying since the time he was 13 that the Lord would just come and pour himself out in his country. So this is going on for years. I think from the time he was 13 until the time he was 17 or 18. And then he begins to having these encounters with the angel of the Lord that would show up at his bedroom. And he was a good Christian young man that was there every time the church opened. And so they thought he was a little zealous, so they figured they would just ship him off to a Bible school and they could deal with the zealousness of what was going on in his life. And he really didn't want to go because he didn't know if the angel of the Lord could find him when he left. And he was really, really concerned that he would backslide when he left his home. So he leaves and he goes off to this Bible school, and sure enough, 2 weeks passed by and he had already backslidden. For the first time in his life since he knew Jesus, when he walked into the sanctuary and he saw the cross, he didn't weep, and he considered that backsliding. Yeah. So he's there at school and he's learning all the things that people learn in school. And one day they have a meeting in another town, so they go over there to this meeting in another town, and there's these old men preachers there giving this meeting, the guys that were like the gray-haired guys that I like to listen to, that have been there and done that, and they're standing there and they're waiting for the next guy to stand up to kind of take their place or fill their shoes in, and so they're sitting there, and this guy, he starts talking and he gives his message and all this stuff, and at the end of his message he prays. He said, "Lord," he said, "bend the church and save Wales." And so they get up and they're dismissed and they go have breakfast, and something about that small phrase, "Lord, bend the church and save Wales," rocked this guy. And it was a lot like Gideon. In that simple phrase, and "Lord, bend the church and save Wales," he heard the identity of who he was. So they go and they have breakfast, and they're sitting there and everybody's talking and blah, 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 blah. And they pass the scones around to have breakfast and tea and all this stuff. And the lady that was hosting it asked him if he wanted some butter for his scone. And he denied. He said, "No, thank you." And as the butter passed by him, he was sitting by the reverend that prayed. And the reverend reached and grabbed the butter. And as the reverend reached and grabbed the butter, all of a sudden this young man that it had got shaken by those few words, Lord, bend the church and save Wales, he had this thought for the first time in his life. He said, Lord, how many times have I let the thing that you've offered me pass by? Like I let the butter pass by. So he gets up and excuses himself from the table, and he goes back into the sanctuary. And he's broken before the Lord, and he's weeping, and he's convulsing. And that thing that stirred him earlier, how the Reverend finished his prayer, it changed inside of him, and it became the identity that the Lord truly spoke over him. But his cry was no longer, Lord, bend the church and save Wales. It was, Lord, bend me and save the church. Or bend me and save Wales. So this takes place, and they're not knowing what to do with this guy, because he was literally convulsing, having fits and stuff like this. And this was 1900. This wasn't Toronto. So they're like, he kind of comes to himself, and they're a little beside themselves. And at the same time all this is happening, there's this group of teenage girls that walk into the sanctuary that had purposed in their heart that they were going to have meetings. Just these teenage girls, they were going to have meetings by themselves. And they would go and meet and just seek the face of the Lord. And this was going on for months and months and months. And they would walk in, and I'm going to get kind of far out there in this story, because God's kind of far out there, and I think that we put him in a box a lot of time. But these girls, they would do the most obscene thing for the 1900s. They'd be locked up in a room in the church just worshiping and praising God, and they were dancing before the Lord. And their pastor didn't know how to handle this, because they were dancing before the Lord. And he didn't know if he should bring correction or just let them kind of continue on. So he made a decision that he was going to stay there every time that they met, just to make sure that it didn't get out of control. And so he pops his head in one day, and as these young teenage girls are worshiping and dancing before the Lord, there's a blue flame that's built up in the circle that they're dancing in, because the presence of the Lord has manifested himself in the room and surrounded himself with their praise. So these girls decide, by the leading of their wonderful pastor, to come to the same meeting that this young man comes in. And as he's crying out, Lord, bend me and save the world, these girls walk into the room. And the shyest girl of the bunch, they had a little testimony service, and she'd never spoke in front of anybody. And she got up to say something, and everybody was kind of shocked, because she was really shy, and she talking in front of people was just beyond her. And she got up, and there was a hush that fell over the room, because nobody could believe that she would stand up and say anything. And this girl gets up, and they said, well, what would you like to say? And simply she said, I love the Lord Jesus with all of my heart. And then all of a sudden, the guy that's over there weeping and convulsing, that's crying out to the Lord, bend me and save the world, he breaks and runs out of this room with his friend in hand, and he said, can you dream with me? Can you dream with me? Can you dream with me? As they're going down the road, because he has to go back home. He can't stay in that building anymore. He has to go. And he goes, what are you wanting to dream? He said, can you dream with me that 100,000 people can be saved? He said, man, you're crazy, but I can dream with you. So he heads home. And this was like 6 weeks after they sent him off to school. And he goes over there, and he goes to church Sunday morning, and he asked the pastor, he said, hey, can I speak? And I'm sure the pastor was like any other pastor, that some kid went off to Bible college for 6 weeks and came home and probably thought he was Billy Graham. But Billy Graham wasn't alive then, so it had to use somebody else. But anyways, so the pastor was really gracious. He said, I'll tell you what. He said, I'll let you have a little prayer service after church is over, and I'll announce it, and I'll invite anybody that wants to stay to stay. He said, that would be amazing. So pastor preaches his sermon, finishes up, and at the end of everything, before everybody walks out the door, says, hey, the young man that just came back from Bible college, he has a few things to say. If anybody would like to hear him, you're free to stay over and listen. 16 people stayed. And it went off really well. So the pastor asked him, he said, hey, would you mind speaking again? Yeah. So 16 people stayed. The next time the whole church was full. In a year's time, over 100,000 people were saved. Because one man and one little girl heard the voice of the Lord over them and who they truly were. So the whole nation basically gets saved because one man heard the voice of the Lord over his life. And he was bold enough to ask a friend if he could have a dream with him. See, but the cool thing about that, it didn't stay in that country. It began to move and shift, and people began to come. And so people from England started coming. And somehow the people in America started hearing about it. And this one spark that happened in a little bitty country ended up igniting and going around the world because one man was bold enough to dream the dream of God and hear the identity that the Lord had spoke over himself. Now, I intentionally left names out, and I intentionally didn't give you very clear where this was, who this was. But that was the Welsh revival that sparked what became Azusa Street and what birthed what is now the Pentecostal denominations. So my whole deal about this is, look, I'm just telling you a story because I just told you a story about Gideon that saved a nation. I told you a story about a coal miner son that was raised up out of the ground that he lived on and saved a nation. Because both of them heard the voice of the Lord over their life, calling out to their true identity of who they were. And it didn't just shift who they were, and it didn't propel them into a life that was lived in the reality of God, knowing who they were before Him. It changed the course of history. It changed the course of history. Thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people were saved. So who are you? Who are you? Are you just a guitar picker? No. Are you? Are you just a guy that used to be in the Marines? Or are you a kid that plays the piano really good and has an amazing voice that loves God madly? Who are you? See, what if the reality of not resisting the butter that was passed flings open the door and lets you really shift more than one room? What if it turns a city on its head? What if when you die, people know you like they knew the apostles, the ones that turned the world upside down? Can you dream that big? Or are you limited to four walls? Are you limited to the structure that's been built around us that we're supposed to conform to because this is all we've ever seen represented? And yeah, we've seen some amazing things that step outside of this structure slightly, but it still fits in this structure. See, what if what the Lord is calling over you? What if the identity of who you are in heaven's eyes burst open the structure of what we consider church to be, and it propels you into some turmoil that looks like hell on earth, but you have to be there to bring heaven on earth? Is it worth the turmoil? Is it worth the misunderstandings? Is it worth the confusion? Is it worth it? See, because here's the cool thing about Gideon, and I'm sure it happened in Evan Roberts' life too. I think that's what happened when he was weeping before the Lord. There was a cry that burst forth in him, and there was a sacrifice in Gideon's life. See, something was sacrificed before God in both instances before they were propelled into the reality of what heaven declared over them. Now, I know, yeah, sacrifice. We know all this stuff. We know it way too well. We've become familiar with something that we don't know is the sad reality of it. We've heard stories that we can quote. We've heard stuff we've memorized. And I'm not trying to be hard and I'm not trying to be ugly. But we know this thing too well. We know the Word of God, but do we know the God of the Word? To the place that we can lean in and we can hear what He's called us. We can lean in and we can hear how we're known in heaven. See, because I have this sneaking suspicion that if I'm supposed to step into the thing that heaven knows me by, that I really have to leave something right there before I ever go forward. So, who wants to go forward? Y'all are boring. You sitting on your hands. That was a question. Who wants to go forward? Who likes four walls that look like everybody else? Who likes 4 songs in a sermon? Not me. So let's dream for a second. Let's dream for a second. So I'm going to dream, but I'm going to dream out loud for a second, okay? And as I dream, I want y'all just to picture like it's a blank canvas. And I'm the guy painting the picture, but y'all get to fill in your own life. I'm just painting the picture up here. But see what I'm going to do? I'm going to take my biggest brush, because that canvas, it has to be filled, okay? The background can't be whitened. It just has to be filled. So I'm going to take big, broad strokes, and I'm going to fill everything in that has to be filled. You ever considered that's what everything has done up till now? What if up till now was just the big, broad strokes of God's brush on your canvas of life, and He was filling in the background, so when the focal point of the picture comes into play, all this stuff was already set. It was already there, and it had to be there. It had to take the big, broad strokes of God's brush to paint this picture, so when the focal point comes into view, that everything else has a story behind it that leads you, and it captures your eye. I'm an artist. I studied art, so just follow me for a second. But you create a piece of art, you don't want your eye to be stuck on the focal point. That's a boring piece of art. You walk in, it's like that bird back there. I walk in, I see a bird. No. That's not art. That's a bird. Somebody put a red eagle on the wall. That's not art. Art is, I've created this thing so well that, yeah, I do have a focal point, but everything else on that canvas has a meaning, it has a place, it has a purpose. And my eye is going to flow through that whole canvas, and it's going to see everything that was put there because it is all put there intentionally by the hand of the Creator. And it's going to draw you into the focal point of the picture. So what if all the crappy scenarios, all the crappy circumstances that each and every one of us have walked throughout our life was just actually the big broad strokes of God's brush, painting the picture and setting the background. So now it's time for the focal point to start being manifested. It's kind of fun in not using the Bible. It's all the same. So who's ready to go somewhere besides here? Raise your hand again. Okay. If you truly mean that, do something. Besides, raise your hand. I'm done. I don't have anything else to say. But there was a sacrifice that happened. There was an earnest, heartfelt decision that was made and submitted unto God as a sacrifice in both cases. If you're ready to go for it, if you believe, honestly believe, not because I'm standing up here and I'm trying to convince you of something. I'm not. I'm just telling a story. I'm just telling a story. But if there's something in your heart that is stirring, and you know deep in the depths of your very being that I wasn't made to stand in this place right here. There's something that you've called me to. And I'm not even sure what it is, and I'm not sure what it looks like. I don't even know what it sounds like, and I sure don't have the language even to wrap around it, because all I've ever seen is this structure that I've come in and out of most of my life, and I've found it familiar because there's something about your peace that rests in it, and I know I can come and find you there. But I know you're more than just a structure that people meet in. I know you're more than just a place that people gather around your presence. I want to hear how heaven knows me. And if it means I have to do something and I have to walk out of the comfort of everything that I know into the unknown, because I know that's what heaven is called over me. Without even knowing what it is, I present a yes that's crying out deep, deep within me. And whatever sacrifice it needs to be sacrificed, I lay it at your feet. And I ask you to come and burn the sacrifice up and let me step into the fullness of everything that I'm known by in heaven. So however that looks to y'all, but now we're getting out of a normal structure, right? See, normal structure says sit on your butt in a seat. I'm not trying to be hard, and I'm not really trying to make you do anything. But normality says I can sit here and I can make this decision. That says otherwise. If you mean it, do something besides sit there and make a mental assent to agree upon something. So Jesus, have your way. Do what you want. Let it look like how it's supposed to look. Let it sound like how it's supposed to sound. And if it doesn't fit in the way that we understand, that's absolutely okay. break what needs to be broke, remove what needs to be removed, let things die that need to die, and resurrect things that need to be resurrected.